So we're talking about user testing. I've mentioned this a few times. User testing is a really important part of the game design process. It's hard to really. It's one of those things where you don't really get it until you've actually tried it, until you've actually created a game and then have people give you feedback. It's hard to understand exactly how valuable it is. But getting that type of feedback is really, really important. And it's also an important part of any artistic process to be able to get feedback from other people and incorporate that feedback into your work. So, most of the time as artists and developers and designers, we tend to spend a lot of time working on our own on the computer, obsessing about details and kind of thinking about how do we get our vision on the screen. And that is a good thing to do. That's really fun. I spend most of my time, doing that. But I think sometimes we can kind of lose track of how other people see the stuff that we're working on. So sometimes we have an idea of what something looks like that doesn't necessarily is not exactly the same as what other people see. And so one way that we can sort of make sure, like, oh, this thing that I think looks really cool is actually translating to other people who are playing the game is through doing user testing. And so this isn't just for games; it applies for any medium. But it's especially important for games because games are interactive. So there's this component to user testing, which is like, could you even do the game? Like, did it even make sense to you what you were supposed to be doing? And then there's the regular component of, did you like it? Was it fun? Did it look cool? Did you like the sound? Like all of these different components of the game. So it's a really important part of the process. It's hard to do because you need to have a game first before you can do the user testing, and we only have a semester, so it's hard to do all of that stuff during one semester. But anyway, let's get into it. So throughout the semester, we've discussed things like positive and negative feedback, progression and emergence, goals, rewards and obstacles, and all these other aspects of designing game mechanics. So now we can put these principles in action and collect information based on the user experience of our games. User testing is an essential aspect of game design. Unlike other artistic disciplines, interaction is an essential component of game design. So we can't call our games finished until we test how people interact with them. Games are meant to be played, so we need to understand what works and what doesn't to make sure our work is playable. So first we'll talk a little bit about what to test for. So getting good feedback from users depends on asking good questions. We could just say, did you like the game? And they might say yes or no, but it won't really tell us why or why not or what we can do about it. So part of user testing is knowing what to ask for, what to look for. And that might change depending on what you have in your game. So first we have to think about bugs versus playability. Sometimes a game just doesn't work. Like if I hit a button and it's supposed to start the game and the game doesn't start, that's just a bug. That's not really, part of the game experience. So ideally, we can play test our games so that we fix all those major bugs before we have people play them. But inevitably, all games have bugs. You may never run into them, but there's a bug in there somewhere. If you really look for it, eventually you'll find it. So we're not going to be able to get rid of all the bugs, but we want to get rid of enough bugs that we can test the playability and not like what's broken with the game. So bugs versus gameplay. Oops. So another thing to ask about is onboarding and guidance. We've talked about that at a few different points during the semester when it comes to level design. How do we get the player involved in the game? Like how do we introduce the mechanics? How do we get them to understand the controls, understand the game world that they're in, what their expectations are, what their goals are? All of those things that happen at the very beginning of the game can be referred to as onboarding or guidance. And so that's a good thing to ask for. Was it easy for the player to find the instructions or basically understand the controls? So, a lot of gamers know that if you see a game and I hit the right button, the player goes right. That's how games work. But not everybody knows that, or it may not be clear at the beginning of the game. So we want to make sure that that is clear. And does the player understand the basic goals or game mechanics? So, just asking simply like, was the goal clear? If the goal is really clear, just to get to the end of the level or find, a certain object or find a key or something like that, that's good. But if the player says, I didn't know what the point was, I didn't know what the goal of the game was, that's something that we need to be aware of and to work on. Playtime is another good thing to ask about or test for. How long did the player play the game? Did they make it to the end? Did they give up on the game? Why might they have given up on the game? So those are some good questions to ask in the user survey. And it's good to also have a sense of what your expectation is. Like if with our games, they're probably not going to take somebody an hour or 10 hours or 15 hours to play. Most of our games are going to be pretty short because we have a pretty small amount of time to make them. So if the gameplay is 10 minutes, that might be pretty good for us. If the gameplay is 10 minutes for like, some major studio game, that would be really bad because those games are designed to take up a lot of time. So that's an important thing to do to understand, first of all, how long do we expect the player to play for? So you might want to play the game yourself and say, it took me, 3 minutes to finish the game. So given that I designed it, I would expect somebody else to take about 5 minutes. And so that's what I might ask, how long did it take to play? And then if they could make it to the end. So if it was too hard to get to the end, that's a good thing to know. Your player may say, "Oh, I'm not that good at games," and so that might explain why. But if everybody says I couldn't make it to the end, that probably indicates that the game is too hard, or maybe it's not enough fun or motivating enough for the player to continue playing. So here's my very rough drawing of one of my survey questions. And yeah, as I mentioned, it's a good idea to have a goal in terms of the gameplay length. Okay, so some principles of testing. So expect your users to have little or no familiarity with gaming. So this is something that is kind of hard to internalize, I think, but we have a tendency to expect to kind of like lose sight of the fact that if you spend all your time playing video games, you might be pretty good at video games. A lot of other people may not be. And so you might be surprised, like, oh, it should be so obvious that you have to jump over this, thing at the beginning of the game, but some people are too stupid to figure that out or something like that. That's not a great attitude because you have to assume that if somebody can't figure out how to do something, it's because you haven't taught them how to do it rather than that they're not capable of doing it. So that's something that you want to keep in mind. Don't assume that your user is really bad if they can't play the game. It may be that they're bad, but it may be that you just haven't showed them the right way to play the game, or you haven't given them enough guidance for how to get into the game. So again, that doesn't mean the game has to be easy. If I show the user how to play the game correctly, I can then have a really hard game, but they may not, as long as they know what they're doing, they might realize like, oh, this game is way too hard for me, but I know what I'm supposed to do versus I have no idea what's going on. So then we also want to look at both qualitative and quantitative types of feedback. So you've probably heard those terms before. Qualitative just means descriptions, so writing about the game, and quantitative means things with numbers, like a chart or a scale or 1 to 5, things like that. And it's good to have both of those types of data because you can compare them to see what the sort of trends are. So you might see things in the qualitative data that's harder to capture, and you might see things in the quantitative data that'll give you general trends of how many people experience this type of feedback. Okay, so quantitative feedback, anything that uses a number or a scale, anything that can be like charted or averaged is quantitative. And so you want to have a good amount of this because it can give you a good sense of how the game works just very quickly. So for example, if you ask something like, how long did the game take to play? If we have a nice chart, you can really easily see. So for example, the greater than 20 minutes, the yellow section, that's probably pretty unlikely. So, the fact that that's not the whole circle is fine. If it's less than 5 minutes, that's probably bad. We want people to play for at least 5 minutes. So the fact that that's like a smaller part of the chart, I can visually say, oh, that's good. Most people played for longer than 5 minutes. And then this 5 to 10, 10 to 20, that's like that's what I expected somewhere in there. So the fact that most people are in that range tells me that I have the correct expectation. So this is using quantitative data, I can get an overall view of how people see the game very easily just by looking at a visualization. So it's useful for that. So another example, rate the difficulty. So if I ask people to rate the difficulty and I can see too hard, hard, medium, easy, and too easy. So I can see most people said medium. And that's good. That's what, medium is probably what I want. A few people did say too hard, and a fair amount of people said hard. So maybe depending on what my audience is and what my goals for the game are, I might say, this is great. I want the game to be hard. I don't want it to be too easy. So there's only a couple of people who said it was too easy, and a lot of people said it was medium to too hard. So I'm happy with those results. If you're making a different type of game, like if I was making a casual game that I wanted like, children to play or something like that, I might want it to be easier. So I might say, it's not acceptable to have three people say that it's too hard and only two people say that it's too easy. So I need to adjust the mechanics. So another way we can kind of like visually see what people's responses are. So for qualitative feedback, that's a verbal or written response. And so people can, you know, this will be more unpredictable. This will be more general questions where people can write whatever they want. And so it's useful to kind of give people a chance to say something. So say something that might not be captured by the other questions that I ask. Somebody might say like, I really love the enemy that had like the pink face or something like that. And then you can say, oh, that's cool. Like they like this aspect of the game. That gives me something that I can, use in the future. Or they might say like, this particular thing reminded me of something else that you maybe never thought of. And so that's a good way for you to capture stuff that wouldn't necessarily be in your charts and your quantitative questions. So qualitative feedback is also important. That's what a qualitative question looks like. Somebody just writing a bunch of lines. Um, One thing is that you do want to frame your questions with qualitative feedback. So you can say like, what did you think of the game? And people are just going to say whatever they want to say. But you might want to frame the questions more. Might want to say like, what was your least favorite aspect of the game? So asking people to think about what was not good, so that you can improve on it. Or you could ask, what was your favorite part of the game? So you can get a sense of what people really enjoyed. Um, so yeah, that's what I just said. So there's a lab for this week on user testing. Uh, that is up on the lab page. Let me go there. I think the link should be here now. Okay, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing because there's a lab for that, but basically what you're going to do is create a Google form. So if you go to the Google Forms, if I assume everybody has a Google account. If you don't, that's okay. You can make one. And you're just going to create a blank form and fill it in with some different questions. And then you can include a link of that on your itch page. So I'll show you guys what that looks like real quick. If I go to my itch page, um, and I have to find my game where I added this. So I basically just added a link to my Google form here so that people can give feedback. So that way I can send my itch page to, my friend or a family member or somebody on a Discord or other people in the class, obviously. And so you can send them the itch page. They can play the game directly in the browser, and then they can click on your survey and fill it out. So you can see this is my example survey. Yours may look like this. It may look different. You can kind of decide what you want to put in there. But they can fill it out and submit it so that you can get the responses, and go over that on the Open Lab. And then the last thing for that, so you don't actually have to submit the form, although you can if you want. What you really need to submit is the actual feedback. So that's what I talk about in the lab. When you get the responses from your Google form, let me go back to that page. Oh, I'm in the wrong account. Let's see. I have too many Google accounts. Where is it? Okay, there it is. So when you finish your form and you get the feedback, you'll get some responses. and they will look like this. This is just some fake responses that I created. And so that's where you'll make your Open Lab post from, is from those charts and whatever you want to write about your feedback. So that's what I go over in the user testing lab. It's pretty easy, but you are going to need a little bit of time. You know, you're going to need some time for other people to play your game and test it before you can actually complete the lab. So you may have to wait a bit to do it. But yeah, that's the user testing assignment that, you know, theoretically would be the last assignment that you would do in the publishing tier once you've done the build and the itch assignments. Okay, so I'm going to stop my screen recording, and if you guys have any questions,